Why did the Roman army never lose twice? Or did it lose after all? The real history of Rome is not a chronicle of continuous triumphs. It is a history of catastrophic, almost unimaginable defeats that should have wiped them off the map. The Battle of Cannae, the catastrophe in the Teutoburg Forest, the defeat at Carrhae. In these battles, the Roman armies were not simply defeated, they were almost completely destroyed. Any other ancient power faced with such a situation would probably have signed a peace treaty on any terms and disappeared from the pages of history. But Rome always came back. It came back more organized, more methodical, and more effective than before. Rome's secret was not that it never fell. Its main secret was that it always rose again, having learned its lessons. The Roman military machine was, in essence, the world's first system built on learning from mistakes. Each crushing defeat was merely a prelude to a new, more perfect version of the army. They didn't just mourn their losses, they analyzed their causes with cold engineering precision. Watch the video to the end to learn how the Romans turned their worst nightmares and greatest humiliations into the foundation for a 1,000-year empire. What if I told you that everything you believed about Roman invincibility is not true? Their true strength did not lie in the fact that they never lost. It lay in their political and psychological refusal to accept defeat as the final outcome. For most states at that time, losing a decisive battle meant the end of the war. The king or leader would admit defeat, pay tribute, and become a vassal. That was the logic of the ancient world. Rome lived by completely different rules. After the Battle of Cannae, where, according to estimates, several tens of thousands of soldiers were lost, the Carthaginian commander Hannibal awaited envoys with a peace offer. He was confident that Rome was broken, but the envoys did not arrive. Instead, the Senate in Rome made a series of decisions that shocked Hannibal. They banned public mourning so as not to show weakness. They refused to ransom thousands of captured legionnaires from Hannibal, stating that Rome did not need soldiers who had allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. Moreover, the Senate immediately ordered new legions to be recruited. They armed even those who were not normally conscripted and prepared for a long, grueling war. Rome made it clear that the loss of its army was merely an unfortunate setback, not a reason to surrender. This approach was completely incomprehensible to their enemies. How can you fight when your best armies have been destroyed? But for the Romans, the war was only over when the enemy was completely subjugated, not when Rome lost a battle. This unyielding will was Rome's first and foremost shield. It gave the military machine time to work on its mistakes, regroup, and strike back. Without this political stubbornness, no military reform would have made sense. They saw defeat not as a sentence, but as a problem that needed to be solved. If the enemy was strong in cavalry, then a way had to be found to counter it. If the legions could not fight in the forest, then tactics had to be changed, or fighting in the forest had to be avoided. This mentality turned Rome into an enemy that could not be defeated once and for all. The destruction of one Roman army simply meant that in a year's time, a new one would appear in its place, one that would know much more about the enemy's tactics than the previous one. Is the Roman approach stubbornness or incredible willpower? We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about this reaction to total defeat? Write about it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations. Are you ready to learn the truth about what happened to an ordinary farmer when he joined the Roman legion? The secret lay not in brilliant commanders, but in a ruthless system known as disciplina militaris. This system was not just a set of rules, but an entire philosophy that turned civilians into soldiers. It demanded complete obedience and endurance. It was disciplina militaris that ensured that the army functioned as a single mechanism. While Rome's enemies often relied on individual bravery, the Romans relied on collective action. Each legionnaire was a cog in a machine that never failed. The basis of everything was daily, grueling drill. This process was monotonous and brutal, designed to push recruits to the limits of their physical abilities. Training began at dawn and ended only at sunset. The Roman historian Vegetius wrote, "Victory in war depends not so much on bravery as on preparation." The Roman command understood that bravery in battle runs out, but skills that have been honed to perfection remain. Preparation meant predictability in the chaos of battle. Legionnaires trained every day, regardless of the weather. Whether it was the scorching sun of Gaul or the freezing rain of Germany, the drill never stopped. This tempered not only the body but also the spirit, accustoming soldiers to any adversity. These exercises were deliberately made difficult in order to build up reserves of strength. The principle was to make training harder than actual combat. Soldiers had to get used to constant discomfort and extreme exertion. Recruits spent hours learning how to wield weapons with heavy wooden swords and woven shields. This training equipment was often twice as heavy as real combat models. Strikes were practiced on poles dug into the ground to simulate the enemy. It was believed that if a soldier could fence for hours with such heavy equipment, then in real combat, his real gladius would seem as light as a feather. This gave him a huge psychological and physical advantage. The soldier felt faster and stronger than the enemy. Forced marches were the basis of Roman strategic mobility. It was the legion's ability to quickly cover huge distances that allowed Rome to strike where the enemy did not expect them. It was not for nothing that the legionaries were nicknamed Maria's mules. 3 times a month, each legionnaire had to make a forced march of almost 30 kilometers in full gear. There was a normal marching pace and a forced pace, which was also practiced for hours. The discipline of the march was ironclad. This equipment, known as a sarcina, weighed more than 20 kilograms. It included not only armor and weapons, but also tools for the camp, a mess tin, and a supply of grain for several days. The legionnaire carried everything necessary for war and life. The Roman army was perhaps the only army of antiquity that devoted so much time to training in complex formations. While other peoples fought in crowds, the Romans acted as a single unit. Their strength was in their order. The famous tortoise, or testudo, was just one of many formations. This formation of closed shields on all sides protected against projectiles during sieges. No less complex were the maneuvers of cohorts in field battles, such as changing lines. These maneuvers required hundreds of hours of practice on the parade ground. Each soldier had to know his place and move at the signal of a trumpet or the sign of a centurion. In battle, there was no time for hesitation. Pure automatism was required. In addition to purely combat training, every legionnaire was also required to be a civil engineer. Roman soldiers were equally confident wielding a sword and a pickaxe. This versatility was their secret weapon. Daily work, or opus, was as integral a part of service as fencing. It included digging defensive ditches, felling trees for palisades, and erecting camp walls. It was hard physical labor. The Roman army never spent the night in the field without a fortified camp. Building a castrum after a long march was a mandatory routine. This skill allowed them to build bridges, roads, and siege engines, which was no less important than swordplay. The system of discipline was maintained through a complex balance of rewards and very strict penalties. Soldiers could receive cash bonuses, honorary necklaces, or wreaths for bravery. This was highly valued and motivating. However, punishments were much more well-known. A centurion had the right to beat an offending soldier with his vine. Sleeping on guard duty could be punished by death at the hands of comrades. For mass cowardice or loss of the banner, the legion could be subjected to decimation. This was a horrific procedure in which every 10th soldier in the unit was chosen by lot for execution. This created mutual responsibility and the highest level of accountability because one person's mistake cost another their life. This ruthless system turned yesterday's peasants and craftsmen into true professional soldiers. A complete transformation of personality took place. People learned to put duty and orders above their own lives. As a result, Roman legionaries were objectively stronger, more resilient, and better trained than any of their opponents. They could march farther, carry more, and fight in formation. They were universal instruments of war. Their main advantage was discipline. Where a Gallic warrior would rush into a furious but disorderly attack, a Roman would maintain formation. They trusted not their fury, but their shield, sword, and comrade on their right. It was this iron discipline that allowed the army not to fall apart in panic after the first setback. Most ancient armies fled if their first attack was repelled, but the Romans were different. If the front line, consisting of young Gastati, became tired or suffered losses, it did not break formation. The soldiers knew the maneuver, to retreat in an orderly fashion behind the second, fresh line of principals. This required incredible coordination. The second line entered the battle, while the first line reorganized and rested in the rear. This mechanism of rotating fresh forces right in the thick of battle shocked their opponents. They faced wave after wave of organized legionnaires. Do you think that the ultimate goal, creating the perfect soldier, justifies such harsh training methods? This system certainly produced results, but the price was high. However, as we have already understood, a muscular and resilient soldier was not enough to win. Brute strength and endurance were only the foundation. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret that allowed an entire legion to fight effectively, even while they slept. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman army. It is not swords or eagles. The secret is that the Roman legion never spent 2 nights in the same unprotected place. Wherever the Roman army went, even if it was only for 1 night, it immediately began construction. At the end of each day's march, the legionaries did not rest. They picked up shovels, pickaxes, and axes. In a few hours, working with incredible coordination, the army built a full-fledged fortress around itself. This fortress, known as castra, camp, was always built according to the same standard plan. A deep ditch, fossa, was dug around the camp. The excavated earth was immediately used to build a high rampart, agger. On top of this rampart, the legionaries erected a sturdy palisade, vallum, which each soldier carried with him. Inside, the camp was divided into streets in a strict grid pattern, like a small city. There was a main street, Via Principalis, and a forum square, where the commander's tent, praetorium, stood. Each cohort and each centuria knew their exact location for setting up their tents. This standardization was of enormous importance. A soldier from a legion stationed in Britain could enter a camp built by a legion in Syria and find his tent or warehouse with his eyes closed. This eliminated any confusion. The existence of such a camp gave the Romans an incredible tactical advantage. At night, the army was completely safe. Sudden night attacks, which were the scourge of other armies, were useless against the Romans. Moreover, the camp served as a psychological weapon. Enemies who watched an impregnable fortress grow in an empty field in 3 hours fell into despair. They understood that they were dealing not just with a crowd of warriors, but with an organized force. If the army lost a battle in the field, it always had a place to retreat to in an organized manner. Safe behind the walls of the camp, the legions could regroup, take care of the wounded, and prepare for the next day. This practice of building a fortress every day was unique to Rome. It required tremendous discipline and engineering skills from every soldier, but it was this practice that ensured that the army, even when in the heart of enemy territory, would always be at home. What happened at Cannae should have destroyed Rome. Tens of thousands of its best soldiers disappeared in a single day. Guess what Rome did in response? It began to learn. This battle, which took place in 216 BC, became the darkest page in the history of the Republic. The losses were not just great, they were apocalyptic. Rome lost almost its entire active army. Any other ancient state would have inevitably surrendered after such a blow. But Rome, having lost its consuls and the cream of its aristocracy, merely gritted its teeth. It did not ask for peace. The defeat at Cannae was not just a defeat, it was a tactical masterclass from Hannibal. He exposed the main weakness of the Roman army at that time. The Roman legions, built in 3 lines, Gastati, Principes, and Triarii, were a powerful but unwieldy sledgehammer. The Carthaginian commander Hannibal Barca demonstrated complete tactical superiority. He used the strengths of the Romans, their discipline and momentum, against them. He lured them into a perfectly prepared trap. This battle exposed a fundamental weakness in the Republican army. The Roman Manipular Legion was strong in head-on combat, but it was designed to overwhelm the enemy with mass, moving only forward. Hannibal used weaker infantry in the center to lure the Romans into the trap. Then his elite cavalry, superior to the Roman cavalry, struck from the flanks and rear. The Roman army found itself surrounded, unable to maneuver. Hannibal's plan was ingeniously simple. He lined up his Iberian and Gallic infantry in a crescent in the center. He ordered them to retreat slowly and in an orderly fashion under Roman pressure. The Romans rushed into the gap, drawing themselves deeper into the Carthaginian formations. At that moment, Hannibal's elite Libyan infantry flanked them. At the same time, his cavalry defeated the weak Roman cavalry and closed the ring from the rear. Despite the shock, the Roman Senate began to analyze the situation. They realized that their traditional tactics no longer worked against such a flexible and cunning enemy. They needed reform. The news of the disaster plunged Rome into mourning and horror. However, the Senate did not waver and did not discuss the terms of surrender. Instead, the senators began a cold and sober analysis of the reasons for the defeat. It became clear that the old methods of warfare were outdated. The tactics that had brought victory over Pyrrhus or the Samnites were useless. They did not work against a genius like Hannibal, and change was needed. The answer was the so-called Fabius strategy. The commander Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator, ordered the army not to fight. He followed Hannibal closely, attacked his foragers, wore him down, but never gave him a decisive battle. The first emergency response was the appointment of a dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed, earning the nickname Cunctator, meaning the delayer. His strategy was shockingly un-Roman. Fabius forbade his hastily assembled troops from engaging in open combat. He understood that the recruits were no match for Hannibal's veterans. His army followed the enemy like a shadow, keeping a safe distance in the hills. This was not done out of cowardice. Rome needed time to train new legions and, most importantly, to find an answer to Hannibal's tactics. Many in Rome accused Fabius of cowardice and indecision. They demanded battle and revenge. But the dictator understood what others, in their desperation, could not see. The Republic desperately needed a respite. It took time to recruit and train entirely new legions to replace those that had been destroyed. This time was also necessary to reflect on the lessons of Cannae. This answer was found by the commander Scipio, who later received the nickname Africanus. He carefully studied Hannibal's methods. He understood that the key to victory was flexibility and strong cavalry. The name of this answer is Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was one of the few officers who survived that hell. This experience hardened him and made him think differently from his predecessors. Scipio did not simply want revenge. He became Hannibal's best student. He thoroughly analyzed the Carthaginians' tactics and came to the conclusion that the Roman army must become just as flexible. Scipio reorganized the legion. Instead of the old maniples, the cohort became the basic unit, a larger and more flexible unit. A legion of 10 cohorts could maneuver more easily on the battlefield, allocate reserves, and respond to threats from the flanks. Upon taking command in Spain, Scipio immediately began his reforms. He moved away from the old rigid manipular system. He had seen its limitations at Cannae. The cohort became the new tactical unit. It was larger than the manipular and united soldiers from different lines. A legion divided into 10 cohorts could act not as a single sledgehammer, but as 10 fists. Moreover, Scipio did something that the Romans had not done before. He hired allied Numidian cavalry, which was not inferior in quality to Hannibal's cavalry. But the reform of the infantry was only half the battle. Scipio knew that all of Hannibal's victories had been won thanks to his superior cavalry. The Romans, on the other hand, traditionally neglected this branch of the military. Scipio resorted to diplomacy. While fighting in Africa, he managed to win over the Numidian king Massinissa to Rome's side. It was a brilliant move that deprived Hannibal of his best cavalry. In the decisive battle at Zama, Scipio used Hannibal's tactics against him. He allowed the center to bend, but his flanks remained strong, and his cavalry defeated the Carthaginians and struck them in the rear. The decisive battle took place in 202 BC at Zama. Scipio used everything he had learned. He skillfully positioned his troops to neutralize the Carthaginians' war elephants. While Scipio's reformed cohorts held Hannibal's veterans in the center, the main drama unfolded on the flanks. Scipio and Massinissa's cavalry attacked and routed the Carthaginian horsemen. Then they struck Hannibal's infantry in the rear. Rome did not simply recover from Cannae. It analyzed its defeat, copied the strengths of its enemy, reformed its army, and ultimately won. The catastrophe became a lesson that made the army stronger. This defeat should have broken the Republic, but instead it strengthened it. Rome was not afraid to admit its backwardness. It was not ashamed to learn from its worst enemy. What would you have done in the place of the Roman Senate? In the next chapter, you will learn how they copied foreign weapons to become stronger. The Romans were the greatest pragmatists of the ancient world. They had no false pride that would prevent them from acknowledging that their enemy had something better. If they saw a more effective weapon or armor, they immediately copied it, standardized it, and armed their legions with it. The most striking example is the legionnaire's main sword, the Gladius Hispaniensis, or Spanish sword. Before the clash with Hannibal, the Romans used swords more similar to the Greek ones, which were of poorer quality. During the wars in Spain, they encountered Celtiberian tribes who used a short, wide, and incredibly sharp sword that was equally well suited for stabbing and slashing. The Romans were impressed. They did not try to invent something of their own. They simply took the Spanish sword as a model, set up mass production, and issued it to every legionnaire. This sword became a symbol of Rome for the next several hundred years. The same thing happened with the shield. Initially, Roman soldiers used a round bronze shield similar to the Greek hoplon. It was good for duels but inconvenient for close formation. In battles with the Gauls and Samnites, the Romans saw a large, oval or rectangular wooden shield, the scutum. It was lighter, cheaper to produce, and most importantly, its shape allowed soldiers to stand shoulder to shoulder, creating an impenetrable wall. The Romans immediately adopted the scutum. Later, they improved it by making it curved so that it would better cover the body. It was this shield that made it possible to create the famous tortoise formation, testudo, which was invulnerable to projectiles. Even the famous Roman helmet was constantly evolving. The Monte Fortino type helmet was copied from the Celts. Later, after wars with the Dacians, who used curved swords, the Romans added cross ribs to the helmets for extra protection. Roman armor, lorica segmentata, plate armor, was also probably a response to new, more powerful weapons used by their enemies. It provided better protection than chainmail, which they also copied from the Gauls. This willingness to adapt was key. The Roman army did not freeze in one image. It was constantly changing, absorbing the best technologies of its opponents. Defeat often meant that it was time for a technical upgrade. Are you ready for the shocking truth? In the 9th year AD, 3 full legions, the pride of Rome, the pride of Emperor Augustus, entered a dense forest in Germany and simply disappeared. The disaster in the Teutoburg forest, where Quintilius Varus's legions were ambushed by Germanic tribes, was a shock of a different kind than Cannae. It was not a tactical defeat in open field. It was a clash of civilizations. The Roman military machine, designed for open spaces, proved powerless in the dense, swampy forests of northern Europe. The legions could not form up. Their supply trains stretched for miles. Their engineering was useless. Rome's first reaction was revenge. Emperor Augustus was in despair. Rome immediately sent new legions under the command of Germanicus, who conducted several punitive expeditions and recovered some of the lost eagles. But after these campaigns, Rome did something it had never done before. It admitted defeat. Not militarily, but strategically. Rome realized that conquering Germany would be too costly and would bring no benefits. The legions were withdrawn back across the Rhine. Instead of trying to conquer the Germanic forests, Rome began to build the limes, a permanent, fortified border with towers, forts, and walls. This was a fundamental change in the entire imperial strategy. Rome moved from endless expansion to defense. It recognized that there were limits beyond which its military machine could not effectively advance. The army also drew conclusions. The role of the auxilia, auxiliary troops recruited from allied tribes, increased. These units, often Germans or Gauls, were much better at fighting in forests and rough terrain than the heavy legionaries. Rome began to use smaller, more mobile units, vexillations, to patrol its borders instead of moving entire legions. The Teutoburg forest taught Rome flexibility and an understanding of the landscape. This defeat did not lead to a reform of the sword or shield. It led to a reform of thinking. Rome learned not only how to fight, but also where to fight and where not to. Do you think that recognizing your weaknesses and setting boundaries is a sign of strength or weakness? But to maintain such boundaries, soldiers alone were not enough. In the next chapter, we will talk about the true masters of the landscape. A Roman legionary was only half a soldier. The other half of his time was spent as an engineer, builder, and digger. This dual role was no accident, but was fundamental to Roman military doctrine. Every day, even after an exhausting march, the legionaries would first pick up their shovels. They would build a fortified camp, or castrum, with a rampart and a moat. No other army in the world did this with such methodical precision. It was Rome's engineering genius that often defeated the enemy before the battle even began. The ability to build their own roads, bridges, and fortifications made the legions self-sufficient. They could wage war in wild terrain without relying on local resources. Each legion had a large detachment of immunes. These were specialist soldiers who were exempt from routine duties such as guard duty or digging ditches. Their skills were too valuable to be wasted on routine work. This unit included carpenters, masons, surveyors, and engineers. Surveyors used instruments such as gromus to mark out the perfect rectangle of the camp. Carpenters were responsible for assembling siege engines and bridges. These specialists supervised the work, but the legionaries themselves did most of it. An ordinary soldier, or munifex, had to be able to not only fight but also build. He was a universal tool in the hands of the centurion. The most famous example is Julius Caesar's bridge over the Rhine. This event took place during his Gallic campaign. Caesar wanted to demonstrate to the Germanic tribes that Roman power knew no bounds. To invade Germany, he needed to ferry his army across a wide and fast-flowing river. The Germans considered the Rhine a natural barrier that reliably protected them. They did not expect the Romans to be able to cross it. Instead of spending weeks looking for a ford or using risky boat crossings, he ordered a bridge to be built. This decision was not so much tactical as psychological. He wanted to shock the enemy. In 10 days, the legions built a complex engineering structure 400 meters long. Thousands of soldiers worked around the clock, driving piles into the bottom of the fast-flowing river. It was a race against time. The bridge was not just a temporary footbridge, but a sturdy structure made of heavy wood. It was designed to withstand strong currents and the weight of several legions marching in full armor. It was such a demonstration of power and capability that the Germanic tribes were shocked. They realized that even a barrier like the Rhine could not hide them from the Romans. Rome could go anywhere. The same was true of siege warfare. The Romans preferred open battle, but if the enemy barricaded themselves in a fortress, they did not retreat. They began a methodical engineering siege. If the Roman army could not take a city by storm, it began construction. Legionnaires built siege engines known as ballistas and catapults. Ballistas fired heavy arrows, while catapults and onagers threw stones. They also erected huge siege towers. These towers, covered with wet skins to protect them from fire, were rolled up to the walls. From their tops, soldiers could fire on the defenders. During the siege of Alesia in Gaul, Caesar faced the climax of his confrontation. The united army of the Gauls, commanded by Vercingetorix, barricaded themselves in a powerful fortress on a hill. It was their last hope. Caesar found himself in a desperate situation. He was besieging a huge army, knowing that even more numerous reinforcements would soon arrive for the Gauls. He was caught between two fires. He ordered 2 lines of fortifications to be built around the city. The inner line prevented the Gauls from escaping the city. The outer line protected the Romans themselves from the army coming to the rescue. The legionaries built tens of kilometers of walls, moats, and towers. They dug moats and filled them with water. They also set countless traps, such as sharpened stakes driven into the ground. They literally built a new city around the enemies. This work was carried out under constant attack from both sides. The soldiers slept and ate without letting go of their pickaxes or swords. This titanic engineering work, rather than a decisive battle, determined the outcome of the entire Gallic War. The Gallic relief army was unable to break through the outer wall. Alesia was forced to surrender due to starvation. The Roman army could change the landscape itself to suit its needs. They did not adapt to the terrain, but forced the terrain to serve them. This was their key difference from many of their opponents. They drained swamps to deprive the enemy of cover or to build camps on solid ground. They built temporary aqueducts to supply camps with clean water during long sieges. And of course, the legionaries built roads. These famous Roman roads allowed for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. Logistics was the foundation of Roman victories. If the army suffered a tactical defeat in the field, it could retreat to its fortified camp. By nightfall, the soldiers were behind a strong rampart and moat. This gave them time to regroup and deprive the enemy of the fruits of victory. If they needed to cross a river, they built a bridge. For the Roman legion, a river was not an obstacle. It was just another engineering problem to be solved. If they needed to take an impregnable city, they built siege engines. Over time, the legionaries could build a ramp up to the walls or break through any masonry. It was only a matter of time. Engineering was Rome's systematic response to unsolvable problems. Where another commander would see a dead end, the Romans saw only the beginning of work. Rome's enemies may have been brave warriors, but they were no match for an army that moved along roads it had built. They could not defeat an army that could erect a fortress in a matter of hours. It allowed the army to operate where any other army would have stopped. There is a well-known saying that an army marches on its stomach. In Rome's case, it marched on its own roads, and its stomach was always full. Logistics was Rome's secret weapon. Winning a single battle is good, but the ability to wage war for years on foreign territory, hundreds of kilometers from home, that is true strength. Rome was a master of such warfare. The basis of Roman logistics was an incredible network of military roads. The famous phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," has the opposite meaning. All roads led from Rome, allowing legions and supply convoys to move at incredible speed. These roads were built by the soldiers themselves. They were straight, sturdy, and all-weather. They could be used to quickly move entire legions from one province to another, to respond to a threat or compensate for a defeat. While Rome's enemies were gathering militias that dispersed to their homes after the harvest, the Roman professional army could fight all year round. This was only possible thanks to a constant supply of provisions. The staple of a legionnaire's diet was grain. Rome had a complex system called the annona, a government service responsible for purchasing and transporting grain, mainly from Egypt and North Africa. This constant flow of food allowed Rome to maintain huge armies on the borders of the empire. Even if they won a battle, Rome's enemies couldn't destroy the Roman army because they couldn't cut off its supply lines, which were as strong as its roads. If a legion was destroyed, a new one could be assembled in Italy, fully equipped from warehouses and sent along the roads to any corner of the empire within weeks. This logistical power meant that Rome could afford to lose a battle. It simply viewed it as a loss of resources that could easily be replenished. Rome's enemies, on the other hand, often fought at the limits of their capabilities. For them, a single defeat was fatal. For Rome, it was not. The system was important, but it was the people, the commanders and reformers, who analyzed mistakes and changed the system. Ruthless discipline was a tool, but that tool was wielded by specific individuals. They looked at disaster and saw not the end, but an opportunity for improvement. These reformers understood that the enemy would not wait for Rome to adapt. Each defeat was a bloody lesson that had to be learned immediately. They did not cling to outdated traditions if they led to destruction. The history of Roman victories after defeats is the history of specific people. It was their will, intellect, and willingness to take risks that allowed Rome's military machine to evolve. They were the real drivers of progress in military affairs. Take Gaius Marius, for example. At the end of the 2nd century BC, Rome faced an invasion by the Germanic tribes of the Cimbri and Teutons. These tribes moved from the north, sweeping away everything in their path and bringing chaos. They inflicted several humiliating defeats on the legions, such as the Battle of Arausium. It was a disaster comparable in scale to Cannae. The Roman army was unprepared for the fury and sheer numbers of these barbarians. The old system of recruiting the army from landowners was failing. The farmers who formed the backbone of the legions were tied to their land. They could not serve for years away from home, and long campaigns completely ruined them. Gaius Marius, having been elected consul, carried out a radical reform. He understood perfectly well that the old source of recruits had dried up. He needed soldiers who were ready to devote their entire lives to war. He abolished the property qualification and, for the first time, began to recruit the poor, or proletarians, into the army. These were people who had nothing to lose. They had no land of their own and were looking for any way to feed themselves. Marius offered them something they had never had before: stability and a career. He transformed the army from a civilian militia into a real profession. Now a legionnaire was not a farmer who had taken up arms, but a soldier by vocation. Soldiers now served for 20 years and sometimes longer. They received regular government pay, provisions, and equipment. It was hard but steady, full-time work. At the end of their service, Marius guaranteed them a pension in the form of a plot of land. This land was often allocated in the conquered provinces. It was a powerful motivation for yesterday's poor man. This created a caste of professional veterans loyal to their general. The soldiers were loyal not so much to the Senate as to the commander who led them to victory. It was this new professional army of Marius that ultimately stopped the German invasion. Another example is Scipio Africanus, whom we have already discussed. He is often compared to other great commanders of that era, but his main difference was his unique approach to learning from mistakes. His genius was not that he was a great tactician by nature. He was not born with the knowledge of how to defeat the Carthaginians. His genius lay in the fact that he was a great and diligent student. After surviving the horror of the Battle of Cannae, he did not fall into despair like many others. He began to ask the right questions. Why did we lose? What did the enemy do right that we did not? He was the only Roman commander of his time who understood how Hannibal fought. He realized that Hannibal did not win with his infantry center, but with quick maneuvers on the flanks. The key to victory was superior cavalry. He copied his emphasis on cavalry and tactical flexibility of formation. He reorganized the legions so that they could maneuver, not just march forward. He also found a way to neutralize Hannibal's cavalry by luring away the Numidians. He essentially defeated Hannibal by becoming the Roman Hannibal. In the decisive battle at Zama, he used the enemy's weapon against him. It was a victory not of brute force, but of cold analysis and adaptation. Or take Julius Caesar. Fighting in Gaul, he was constantly confronted with a completely different type of warfare. The Gauls were brave warriors, but their tactics were unpredictable. They did not fight in tight formations like the Romans. They used ambushes in dense forests, surprise raids, and guerrilla tactics. They took full advantage of the characteristics of their wooded and swampy terrain. For the Roman legion, accustomed to the open fields of Italy, this was a serious challenge. The standard wall of shields tactic often did not work here. Caesar understood this very quickly and did not insist on it. Caesar did not try to impose a classic wall-to-wall battle on them every time. He adapted to guerrilla warfare. He understood that the Gauls should not be cut down in open fields, but outwitted and worn down. He used engineering to build fortresses and famous lines of fortifications, such as at Alesia. He deprived the enemy of mobility by instantly building bridges across rivers. His legionaries often dug more than they fought. He relied on the incredible speed of his marches and the element of surprise, and he masterfully employed a policy of divide and rule. He used allied Gallic tribes to fight other Gauls, exploiting their knowledge of the terrain. These men, Marius, Scipio, Caesar, were not afraid to change the rules. They were not slaves to old traditions. For them, tradition was only useful as long as it brought victory. They saw a problem, whether it was defeat by Hannibal or the invasion of the Germanic tribes. They analyzed it soberly and changed the army to solve the problem. They changed the structure of the legion, the recruitment system, and the tactics of warfare. They were not just generals leading soldiers into battle. They were true crisis managers. They rebuilt Rome's military machine when it broke down, and each time they made it stronger. And now we come to the main, most fundamental secret of Rome. It is a secret that made all the other factors, discipline, engineering, adaptation, truly effective. This secret is an almost inexhaustible supply of manpower. The Roman system was built on an ingenious principle. It did not simply conquer peoples. It made them its allies, socii, and over time granted them Roman citizenship. What did this mean in practice? When Rome fought Hannibal, it had at its disposal not only the citizens of Rome itself, it had at its disposal soldiers from all over Italy, who were obliged to supply troops to the Roman army. After the disaster at Cannae, Rome lost perhaps a fifth of its entire male population of draft age. For any other power, this would have been the end. But Rome immediately turned to its allies and recruited new legions. Rome's enemies could not afford to do so. Hannibal's Carthaginian army consisted mainly of mercenaries. When he lost them in battle, it was very difficult for him to find replacements. When Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, fought Rome, he won several battles but suffered such heavy losses that he said, "Another victory like this, and I will have no army left." Rome, on the other hand, could afford Pyrrhic victories over and over again. The loss of a legion was a tragedy, but not a strategic disaster. The Senate simply sent a new legion. This system gave Rome the right to make mistakes. A commander could lose a battle, an army could be destroyed, but Rome as a state continued the war. The enemy had to win every time. It was enough for Rome to win once in the end. This depth of strategic reserve was the foundation on which the entire Roman military machine stood. It gave time for analysis, for reforms, for training new soldiers, and for building new roads. Defeat for Rome was only a painful but necessary lesson, and for its enemies, victory over Rome was often only a postponement of the inevitable. So why did the Roman army never lose twice? Because defeat for the Romans was not the end of the story, but only the beginning. It was a signal for analysis, adaptation, and total reform. They changed their tactics after Cannae. They changed their equipment, copying it from their enemies. They changed their entire imperial strategy after Teutoburg. Discipline, engineering, logistics, and almost endless human resources turned every disaster into a painful but incredibly valuable lesson. Rome did not just create an army, it created a system that learned from its mistakes, and therein lay its genius. The history of Rome and its military machine is vast. We have only touched on the tip of how this system adapted and grew stronger after each fall. What other aspects of the Roman army, or perhaps the military reforms of other great empires, would you like to learn about? Please suggest topics for future videos in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next research.